Gordon Ramsay is one of the most influential chefs in the world. He has seen many highs and lows throughout his journey in the culinary industry.
Gordon Ramsay is the loudest voice in the kitchen, the man who built an empire of Michelin stars and turned tough love into a television brand. But behind the swearing and shouting lies, a quieter story he rarely shares. It's about a young chef he called one of his closest friends, a final dinner they never knew would be their last, and a phone call that changed everything. At 59, Gordon has finally opened up about his best friend's death and the heartbreak he carried in silence for years. The night everything changed. Some stories start with fireworks, and some start with something so ordinary you don't even notice it's happening. This one starts with a simple dinner in London. Two men catching up like they'd done 100 times before. One of them completely unaware that he was about to lose someone he loved. The man on the other side of that table was David Dempsey, a Scottish chef from Glasgow who Gordon Ramsay had taken under his wing years earlier. David wasn't just an employee. He was, in Gordon's own words, one of his best mates, the kind of protege every chef dreams of finding once in a career. Sharp, driven, a little intense, David had climbed fast, and Gordon had watched him do it with the pride of a man who genuinely believed he was mentoring the next big thing in British cooking. That night in early May 2003 didn't feel like the beginning of a tragedy. It felt like two friends having dinner. Gordon later recalled, "We had dinner the night he died, and honestly, isn't that the part that still stings the most? No warning, no dramatic goodbye, just an ordinary evening that neither of them knew was ending in the worst possible way." Can you imagine sitting across from someone, laughing, talking shop, having absolutely no idea that within hours their life would be over? That's exactly what Gordon lived through. He noticed something was off with David that night, a kind of tension that didn't quite match the David he knew. Gordon would later describe him as looking like a man under pressure, not the usual easygoing version of his friend. But pressure in a professional kitchen is nothing new. Chefs run on stress the way cars run on fuel. So Gordon didn't think twice about it. Why would he? Hours after that dinner, in the early hours of May 3, 2003, David Dempsey climbed scaffolding on a building near King's Road in Chelsea, smashed a window, and broke into a stranger's flat. Witnesses say he climbed back down, found another way into the building, made his way up the stairs, and then climbed out onto the ledge of a second-floor window. From there, he fell 40 feet to the ground below. 40 feet. Let that sink in for a second. That's not a stumble. That's not a small accident. That's a fall that leaves absolutely no room for a happy ending. When his body was discovered, the news tore through the tight, close-knit world of British fine dining like wildfire. People who had eaten at his restaurant, worked beside him, trained under him, all asking the same impossible question. How did this happen to David, of all people? And here's the part that made it even harder to process. Nobody, not his friends, not his colleagues, and certainly not Gordon, had any idea David had taken cocaine that night. A toxicology report later revealed he had roughly 1.36 milligrams of cocaine per liter of blood in his system, a level a toxicologist described as capable of causing severe toxicity, including erratic behavior and even death. Before he died, David had reportedly told another chef, "I did a bit of Charlie earlier." A chilling, almost throwaway line that nobody could have known was a warning sign. Gordon has said many times since that it never crossed his mind that David was struggling with substance use. That's what makes this story so gutting. This wasn't a man everyone quietly worried about. This was a rising star, someone Gordon trusted completely, someone whose secret life stayed hidden right up until the moment it cost him everything. Think about how strange grief can be sometimes. It doesn't always show up the way we expect. Gordon didn't collapse in front of cameras or issue some dramatic public statement. He went quiet. He kept working. He kept smiling for the shows that needed him to be loud and larger than life, all while carrying something heavy underneath. Isn't that exactly how a lot of people process loss? By simply pushing forward, because stopping feels impossible. But knowing how David died is only half the story. What happened to Gordon in the days, months, and years after that phone call is where things get really personal. And honestly, it's the part he avoided talking about for over a decade. A friendship forged in fire. To understand why David Dempsey's death hit Gordon Ramsay so hard, you have to understand what their relationship actually looked like behind the cameras, long before any of this became a headline. David wasn't some random hire plucked off a resume pile. Gordon spotted something in him early on, that rare mix of talent, hunger, and discipline that separates a good cook from a genuinely great chef. He brought David into his growing empire and eventually placed him as head chef at Amaryllis, Gordon's first restaurant in Scotland, tucked inside the One Devonshire Gardens Hotel in Glasgow. This wasn't a small responsibility. Amaryllis was Gordon's flagship project north of the border, and he trusted David to run it day to day. And David delivered. Just 7 months after Amaryllis opened, it earned a Michelin star, a huge achievement for any restaurant, let alone one that young. For a chef barely into his 30s, that kind of recognition was massive. It meant David wasn't just talented, he was proving himself on one of the biggest stages in the culinary world, and Gordon was right there watching it happen, probably feeling like a proud older brother, more than a boss. Their bond went beyond the kitchen, too. David appeared alongside Gordon in the 2000 documentary series Beyond Boiling Point, traveling with him, working shoulder to shoulder, showing up in multiple episodes as one of the sous chefs closest to Gordon during those grueling early years of building his name. When you spend that many long nights, brutal services, and stressful trips together, something forms that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. It's not quite family, but it's close. In April 2003, David took the next big step. He moved from Amaryllis to become head chef at restaurant Gordon Ramsay in Chelsea, Gordon's most prestigious 3 Michelin-starred flagship, earning over £50,000 a year and stepping into one of the most respected kitchens in the country. This was supposed to be the moment everything paid off. A working-class kid from Glasgow, now running the kitchen at one of London's most celebrated restaurants. It doesn't get much better than that, does it? Except behind that success, something was quietly building. David's mother, David Dempsey, later shared that just 2 weeks before his death, David told her he was thinking about leaving London altogether and heading back to Glasgow to open his own place, something completely separate from Gordon Ramsay's name. She recalled him saying the pressure of working in London had become unbearable. Looking back, she believes if David seemed agitated the night he had dinner with Gordon, it was because he was terrified his secret was about to come out. Isn't that heartbreaking? Here's a young man standing at the very top of his profession, seemingly with the world in front of him, quietly falling apart under a weight nobody around him could see. Gordon didn't know, his colleagues didn't know. Maybe not even David fully understood how much pressure he was carrying until it became too much. That's the friendship Gordon lost. Not a co-worker, not just a talented chef on his payroll, a genuine friend, a protege he'd mentored for years, someone he trusted enough to sit across from at dinner without a single worry in the world. And that trust, that closeness, is exactly what made the aftermath so brutal for Gordon to carry. Think about how many hours these two must have spent together over the years. Early mornings prepping ingredients, late nights closing out services, the kind of shared exhaustion that quietly bonds people in ways a normal 9-to-5 job never could. Kitchens are pressure cookers, literally and figuratively, and the people who survive them together tend to come out the other side as something closer to family than colleagues. That was David and Gordon, two men from working-class backgrounds who found each other inside the chaos of professional cooking and built something real out of it. The devastating blow. There's a difference between hearing terrible news and having to physically confront it, and Gordon Ramsay learned that difference in the worst way imaginable. In the days after David's death, Gordon had to do something no amount of professional success prepares you for. He had to identify his friend's body. Speaking about it years later, Gordon admitted just how much that moment broke him. "I wouldn't wish that on anybody," he said. "I physically broke down. I couldn't go behind that glass screen and identify a guy that I loved dearly. It took years to get over that." Hear that again. Years. Not weeks, not months. Years to even begin processing what happened. This is a man known for being tough as nails on television, someone who can reduce a grown chef to tears in a professional kitchen without blinking. And yet here he was, admitting that this single moment nearly broke him completely. Can you imagine standing behind that glass, being asked to confirm that the person on the other side is someone you shared meals with, laughed with, mentored, and trusted? That's not something you just shake off. That's the kind of moment that rewires how you see the world. For years after David's death, Gordon mostly kept quiet about it publicly. He wasn't ready. He wasn't able to. It wasn't until much later, when he decided to make it part of a larger mission, that he started speaking about it more openly, and even then only in careful, measured pieces. What made things even more complicated was the reaction from David's family. David's mother, Eileen, never fully accepted the way the tragedy played out in public. She felt strongly that certain parts of her son's story were being used or reshaped in ways that didn't sit right with her, especially as Gordon later built an entire documentary partly around the loss of his friend. Grief is complicated enough within a family, and when a public figure is attached to that grief, it becomes something else entirely, something that plays out under a spotlight nobody asked for. Still, there was one moment of connection between Gordon and David's family that stands out, and it says a lot about how deeply this loss stayed with him. Years after David's death, Gordon ended up training David's son as a chef. Speaking about that experience, Gordon said, "For me now, dealing with David Dempsey's son and having him training under my tutelage and watching him grow, God, if only his father was here to witness that. He's missing out on a lot." That's not the kind of quote you give for a headline. That's a man genuinely wishing his old friend could see how his own son turned out, wishing David could witness the very thing Gordon himself got to witness. It shows that even decades later, the loss wasn't something Gordon simply moved past. It followed him, quietly, into new chapters of his life. And maybe that's the part of grief nobody really prepares you for. It's not one single wave that crashes and then disappears. It's more like a tide that keeps coming back at unexpected moments. During a graduation, a promotion, a proud parent moment that should belong to someone else but somehow lands on you instead. For Gordon, watching David's son grow into a chef must have been one of those moments. Joy and heartbreak tangled together so tightly you can't really separate the two. But grief and guilt don't always stay private, especially not for someone as famous as Gordon Ramsay. And what came next, the way tabloids handled David's death, only made an already painful situation even harder to carry. Blamed by the tabloids, losing a close friend is hard enough without the added weight of public blame, but that's exactly what Gordon Ramsay had to deal with in the aftermath of David Dempsey's death. Because David worked in Gordon's high-pressure, high-intensity kitchens, it didn't take long before certain parts of the press started drawing a direct line between David's death and the notoriously demanding culture Gordon was known for building. Gordon Ramsay's kitchens weren't exactly famous for being gentle. His television persona, the shouting, the swearing, the brutal honesty, had already shaped a public image of a boss who pushed people to their absolute limits. So when David died, some tabloids ran with the narrative that Gordon's intensity had somehow contributed to it, that the pressure of working under him had pushed a young chef toward substance use and, ultimately, toward his death. Gordon has spoken about this pressure before, discussing how brutal the world of professional kitchens can be for people at the very top of the industry. He once reflected, cooking at a level where everything has to be perfect creates enormous pressure. acknowledging that the culinary world he thrived in could also quietly crush people who weren't equipped to handle it. That admission alone shows Gordon wasn't blind to the toll the industry can take. But being aware of pressure in general is very different from being blamed for a specific tragedy, and that's exactly the narrative Gordon found himself fighting. Speaking about the aftermath of Amaryllis, where David had made his name before moving to London, Gordon later said, "David's death has been a devastating blow," and added, "I think Amaryllis can rest in peace, and I think that guy will rest in peace." There's something quietly telling in the way he tied the closure of that restaurant so directly to David's memory, almost as if the place couldn't continue without the man who helped build its reputation in the first place. Amaryllis officially closed its doors in 2004, just a year after David's death, and interestingly, it shut down the day before a new Michelin star list was announced in 2006, a list that would go on to crown Gordon the most starred chef in the world, with 7 stars overall, despite the loss of Amaryllis's own star years earlier. Gordon was actually on a family holiday when the restaurant closed, a small detail that speaks to how life kept moving forward, even as the shadow of David's death lingered over that chapter of his career. Meanwhile, David's mother, Eileen, continued to push back publicly against how her son's story was being told. She felt that certain portrayals oversimplified what had really happened, reducing David to a cautionary tale rather than remembering him as a person, a talented chef, a son who was clearly struggling under pressure nobody around him fully understood. It's a reminder that grief doesn't move in one direction. While Gordon carried guilt and heartbreak, David's family carried their own version of that pain, and the two didn't always align. For Gordon, the blame stung in a way that went beyond simple public criticism. This wasn't just about protecting his reputation. It was about being accused, even indirectly, of playing a role in the death of someone he genuinely loved as a friend. And when you combine that kind of accusation with the guilt he already felt from identifying David's body, it's not hard to understand why he stayed quiet publicly for so many years afterward. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being blamed for something you had no idea was even happening. Gordon wasn't in that flat the night David climbed through that window. He didn't hand him anything, didn't know about any of it until it was already over. And yet, because of who he was and the reputation that had already been built around him, some corners of the press found it easier to point fingers at the famous chef than to sit with the harder truth that addiction can hide inside anyone, even someone who looks like they have it all together. Eventually, though, silence stopped feeling like the right answer. Gordon decided that if his pain could actually help someone else avoid the same fate, staying quiet no longer made sense. That decision led him somewhere nobody expected, deep into the world that took his friend away from him in the first place. Turning grief into a mission. Grief either buries you or it moves you to do something, and Gordon Ramsay eventually chose the second path, even if it took him years to get there. In 2017, more than a decade after David's death, Gordon fronted a 2-part ITV documentary series called Gordon Ramsay on Cocaine, a deeply personal project built directly on the loss he'd carried since 2003. Speaking about the motivation behind it, Gordon explained, "I've wanted to understand the world of cocaine ever since I lost one of my chefs at my flagship restaurant in Chelsea, and I wanted to learn why it's becoming such an epidemic, not just globally, but specifically in the culinary world." That single sentence says everything about how long this loss had been sitting with him, quietly shaping decisions behind the scenes long before the cameras ever rolled. The documentary wasn't some soft, surface-level look at substance use either. Gordon went to shocking lengths to expose how deeply cocaine had infiltrated the restaurant industry he'd spent his entire life inside. He had staff test the toilets across his 31 restaurants worldwide for cocaine traces, and the results were staggering. Traces turned up in 30 out of 31 locations. Only one restaurant came back clean. Think about that for a second. An industry built around precision, discipline, and high-pressure perfectionism was, behind closed doors, heavily affected by substance use, the same struggle that had already taken his best friend from him. Gordon didn't stop at exposing his own restaurants either. He described some of the more unsettling requests he'd personally encountered over the years, revealing, "I've been served it. I've been given it. I've had my hand shaken and left with little wraps of foil in it. I've been asked to dust cocaine on top of soufflés to put it on as icing sugar." It's a jarring image, cocaine treated almost casually, folded into the glamour of fine dining like it was just another ingredient. And through it all, Gordon has consistently maintained that despite all that exposure, he personally never used the substance himself, saying plainly that he could have, but he never did. To really understand the scale of the problem, Gordon traveled to Colombia and Central America, meeting coca farmers involved in the earliest stages of production, witnessing the illegal manufacturing process up close, and even joining an elite Colombian anti-narcotics unit on an actual helicopter raid. Back home in the UK, he rode along with police as they arrested impaired drivers, watched officers intercept couriers carrying tens of thousands of pounds worth of illegal substances, and even examined 30 kilos of freshly confiscated cocaine at a forensics lab. This wasn't Gordon playing a role for television. This felt like a man trying to physically confront the thing that took someone he loved. The documentary also opened up space for Gordon to talk about addiction closer to home. He spoke candidly about his own brother Ronnie's decades-long battle with addiction. First cocaine, later heroin, a struggle that had quietly run alongside Gordon's entire rise to fame. Combining David's death with his brother's ongoing fight gave the documentary a weight that went beyond typical celebrity storytelling. This wasn't Gordon lecturing from a distance. This was someone who had lost a friend to substance use and was actively watching a family member fight to survive the same struggle. Announcing the project himself, Gordon said the documentary was gritty and shocking, but importantly, an eye-opener and hopefully a real education to all those in our industry and beyond. He wasn't trying to sensationalize David's death. He was trying to make sure other families didn't have to live through what David's mother and the rest of his loved ones went through. Making that documentary must have meant reliving David's death over and over again, sitting through interviews, revisiting old footage, retelling the story to producers and researchers who needed every detail for the final edit. That's not an easy thing to sign up for, especially for someone who avoided talking about it publicly for so many years. But Gordon clearly decided the discomfort was worth it if it meant even one young chef somewhere might think twice before making the same mistake David did. That mission gave Gordon's grief a purpose, but it also meant reopening a wound he'd spent over a decade trying to keep closed. And that leads to the most recent and arguably most revealing part of this whole story. The moment Gordon finally started talking about David not just as a cautionary tale, but as the friend he genuinely missed. What Gordon Ramsay says now, even now, decades removed from that devastating night in Chelsea, Gordon Ramsay still carries David Dempsey with him. And in recent years, he's become noticeably more open about acknowledging that publicly. In a 2017 conversation promoting his documentary, Gordon put it in the simplest, most heartbreaking terms possible, describing cocaine as something that wasn't glamorous at all, and admitting he'd lost his best mate to it. No sugarcoating, no distancing himself from the loss with formal language. Just a plain, raw admission from a man who rarely lets his guard down that publicly. What's striking is how Gordon's public tone toward David's death has shifted over the years. In the immediate aftermath, back in 2003, he mostly avoided interviews altogether, choosing silence over exposure. It took roughly 14 years before Gordon spoke about the identification process in detail, and even then, it clearly wasn't easy for him. He appeared on The Jonathan Ross Show and expressed real regret about not spotting the warning signs sooner, a regret that seems to sit right alongside the grief itself. It's one thing to lose someone unexpectedly. It's another to spend years wondering whether you missed something that might have changed the outcome. That kind of hindsight guilt is something a lot of people who've lost someone to addiction or substance-related tragedy understand all too well. You replay conversations. You wonder about small moments, a look, a comment, a night where someone seemed a little off. Gordon has essentially admitted to doing exactly that with David, going back over that final dinner in his mind more times than he probably wants to admit. And then there's the connection with David's son, which honestly might be the most quietly powerful part of this entire story. Gordon took it upon himself to help train David's son as a chef, essentially continuing the mentorship relationship one generation later. That's not something you do for publicity. That's something you do because a piece of your old friend still means something to you, and you want to make sure his legacy continues somehow, even in a small way. Meanwhile, the tension between Gordon and David's mother, Eileen, never fully resolved. Eileen remained critical of how her son's death had been folded into Gordon's public narrative, feeling that certain aspects of the story didn't fully honor who David actually was outside of the tragedy. That disagreement is a reminder that even decades later, there isn't one single tidy version of this story. Gordon's grief is real, his guilt is real, but so is Eileen's frustration, and so is the complicated grief of a mother who lost her son far too young. Today, Gordon Ramsay remains one of the most recognizable chefs in the world, still holding multiple Michelin stars across his global restaurant group and continuing to front major television shows decades into his career. But underneath all of that success sits a story he rarely gets to tell in full. A story about a friendship that shaped him, a loss that broke him, and a mission that gave that pain somewhere to go. David Dempsey never got the chance to see just how far his closest friend would go. He never watched Gordon Ramsay rise from an ambitious young chef in London to one of the most famous restaurateurs and television personalities in the world. He never stood beside him at the opening of Michelin-starred restaurants, celebrated best-selling cookbooks, or watched millions tune in to his television shows. Most heartbreakingly, he never realized his own dream of returning to Glasgow to open a restaurant that reflected the passion for cooking both young men had shared. His life was cut tragically short before any of those possibilities could become reality. Yet, in a quiet and deeply personal way, David's legacy has never disappeared. It lingers in the causes Gordon has chosen to support over the years, particularly his willingness to speak openly about addiction and the devastating consequences it can have on families and friendships. It can also be seen in the patience he has occasionally shown struggling young chefs, offering guidance and second chances to those battling personal demons. Friends and colleagues have often noted that beneath Gordon's famously fiery exterior lies someone who understands how fragile life can be and how easily talent can be lost. Perhaps that is the real answer to what happened after David Dempsey's death. It was never defined by a single interview, one emotional documentary, or one public statement. Instead, its impact unfolded slowly across decades, shaping Gordon in ways that were often invisible to everyone except those closest to him. There was grief that never completely disappeared, guilt over the feeling that perhaps more could have been done, and a lasting reminder of how addiction can steal extraordinary potential. Gordon Ramsay built a global reputation as the toughest voice in the kitchen, demanding perfection from everyone around him. But whenever he reflects on David, that hard exterior briefly gives way to something quieter and more vulnerable, revealing not a celebrity chef, but a lifelong friend who still carries the memory of someone he loved and lost far too soon. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.